Aiden Alburo was known as the hero who saved the world from the Demon Lord, and also as the one who dyed half the world with blood. He was also a dragon slayer, but his strength did not help him survive, and after the decisive battle, he was cursed and trembling, looking at the traitors in front of him. This happened as soon as the Demon Lord died, and the protagonist realized that the rest of his comrades knew this from the beginning. The whole thing was that those who want to destroy sin will become it themselves, and this was a legend passed down by the imperial court. The rest simply had no choice, since the Demon Lord was a hereditary being, and whoever killed it would become the new Demon Lord. Khalsis thought that it was good that Aiden would become the Demon King, since he had to sacrifice himself for this country. They had no other choice, and they were not going to apologize for this. He was outraged by their words, but did not say anything out loud, and Shara pointed a magic staff at him and used the great magic seal claymore. The magic light enveloped him, but before disappearing, the protagonist once again looked at his comrades, whom he also considered his friends and colleagues. However, all this was a lie, and now they were all calmly watching what was happening to him. He found himself in pitch darkness, and it would be better to die than to stay here forever in this endless spiral downwards. He always thought that this was an endless fall, and now he was angry at all his comrades, wishing for them to be destroyed. But he had already said these words, reincarnated into another body, and the servants standing nearby were even scared that he woke up so abruptly. The protagonist did not pay attention to the fact that someone was calling him, but was only interested in where he was. His parents were happy that he woke up, but he still didn't understand what was going on. He also didn't know who these people were. The thing was, he had been asleep for 2 days, and that could be the reason for his confusion. The Duchess, hugging him, explained that she was his mother, and said his name was Aiden Remus. The protagonist was surprised when he heard this last name, and not his last name, as he thought it would be better to die in the void. But suddenly he screamed, frightening his mother, as many memories came flooding back to him. He was wary when he noticed this, but soon realized that these were memories of a man named Aiden Remus. From these same memories, he learned what year it was, and calculated that it was 15 years before his death. In the void, on the edge between worlds, abandoned by his companions, he was sure that he died before he could become a demon lord and was forced to commit suicide. The memory of his friend's betrayal made him angry again, and he was sure that they deserved to die, so he was going to find them all. His furious appearance scared everyone around him, especially the 2 servants, who even trembled. This was because the previous owner of this body was a terrible person, and MC felt uncomfortable since he ended up in such a body. In addition, the reason why Remus was unconscious for such a long time was because he was drunk and wet. If he wasn't the son of a duke, he would have been beaten to death by now, and he was well aware of it. A little while later, he managed to get up from his bed and looked at himself. This situation was terrible, and he even began to doubt that he was himself, since he could only dream of this all his life. However, he could check his strength, and so he opened the system window, where his characteristics were listed. The system was the power that a person would gain by eating a berserker's heart, along with the title of Dragon Slayer. Since the system was still there, it meant that this was not a dream. However, it bothered him that his name was broken. But in the end, he decided that it didn't matter, since it was a gift from the gods, and now he just needed to find the traitors and tear them apart. As he was saying this, Philip just came into the room, horrified, assuming that this was addressed to him. Aiden didn't understand his state, and he tried to act normal and handed him a cup of drink. The protagonist took it and thanked him, and this only horrified him more, and he began to imagine many possible scenarios, each of which was terrible. In the end, the protagonist tried the drink, and the fact that he liked it only amazed Philip more, and he stared at MC for a while and did not leave, and so he assumed that he wanted something else. He didn't want anything, and so he left the room, and his companion didn't understand how he got out of there alive. He shared his shock, and the other guy was also amazed, assuming that Aiden had gone crazy. To MC himself, all this seemed crazy, since he went back 15 years into the past and did not understand what happened to his past self then. He assumed that he could exist in the present time separately from it, and he remembered that by this time he should have already gained independence from Master Valken, the former king of mercenaries. He was going to find out, and so he called out to Philip, who was surprised again, since he had never called him by name. He was going to ask him a question, and in Philip's imagination, his expression became terrifying, and the other servant, also wary, thanked him for everything, as if already preparing for his death. Philip did not understand what was wrong with Aiden today, but still went with him to the room and was surprised when he heard about the king of mercenaries. The protagonist was curious about him, as he was quite famous as the mercenary king's apprentice. There were rumors that the mercenary king had disappeared some time ago, and in his past life, it was the same. However, Philip had never heard of the mercenary king having apprentices, and MC did not understand what the past him was doing in that case. In his past life, in the slums of Aden, when he was still a child, he tracked down a man who could be tried to rob. He encountered him and quietly stole a bag of coins from him, happy at how much of it was in the bag. However, Vulcan returned, noticing his scam, and remarked that he had enough courage. He did not understand how he dared to even think about stealing his money, but he did not seem angry, although the protagonist was scared. Vulcan assessed the state of his body and appointed him as his apprentice, dragging him in the direction he needed and ignoring the protagonist's screams. That was how he met Vulcan, and since then he became famous as his disciple, and later, after killing the Mad Dragon, he became the Demon Slayer King. However, now there was no information about the mercenary king's disciple, and this information shocked the protagonist very much. Sometime later, the servants were chatting among themselves, as Aiden had changed recently. Last time, Philip spilled wine, and he did not even react to it, and also became more polite and began to thank the syllable and call them by name in a friendly manner. They understood that people change after a serious illness, but they began to worry about Aiden's condition, as recently he looked lethargic and his eyes appeared to be very empty. He was sitting alone on the street, but his condition was not caused by the fact that he was still sick, but because he had nothing to do. All the food was prepared, he did not need to clean, and in the free name, he searched for information about his past self. But it turned out that such a person simply did not exist. He thought about betrayal, resentment, and revenge, but was quickly distracted by the sound of blows. Knights were fighting nearby, and there were many of them in the duchy. Karl Remies came closer to him, not understanding why he was here. He was his younger brother, and unlike the previous owner of this body, who was a scoundrel, he was diligent and had already become a knight, so he even had a right to inherit the throne. If there was a problem, it was that Karl was very disrespectful to his older brother. He thought that his older brother would be drinking as usual, but instead, he was sitting here. The protagonist realized that he thought his older brother was pathetic, since he spent all day gambling and drinking, and you could see the contempt and feeling of superiority over him on his face. In the end, he honestly admitted that he was just bored, and Karl warned that knight training is not a spectacle, and if the protagonist is not here to train, then he should leave. When he thought about training, he realized that he has not picked up a sword since everything happened, and so he agreed to train, and Karl was very shocked by this. Sometime later, he was already on the training ground, and Bazan greeted him before the duel began. He also prepared himself, and the other knights suggested that they should stop this, since MC was still too young after all. However, they also thought that Bazan would deliberately lose. He himself was nervous, since he could not believe that he would have to fight this rude guy. He couldn't lose to such a weakling, as no one could lose to the neighbor's dogs. But his excitement was noticeably too strong, and the protagonist realized that he was thinking about how to lose. He wanted to warm up, and so he was going to ask Bazan to give it his all. He asked him to do everything in his power, as a knight's apprentice who lost to a weakling slacker was practically useless, and in that case he would have to expel him from the order. Bazan was amazed, and the other knights were dissatisfied, as Aiden had completely lost his mind and wanted to seriously fight the squire, although he had never held a sword in his hands. Bazan decided to start and got ready, instantly jumping from his place. And yet, despite his speed, MC managed to parry the blow, although his new body was much weaker than he thought. But for some reason, he wanted more blows and felt more and more inspired. They fought for some time, and the knights were already terrified, since Bazan was giving it his all, and it would be bad if he hurt Aden. But it was not only Bazan's strength that caught their attention, but also how the protagonist was holding up against his blows. Even Karl did not understand how he did it. Bazan was also amazed that MC did not fall, since he was sure that he did not have a single chance, but he could not reach him. Each blow Aiden parried, and this refreshed him, and his blood began to boil. He had not felt such delight for a long time, and when he began to strike his own blows one after another, he gradually began to push Bazan back. The knights thought they were imagining things, and even Karl was surprised that the protagonist was gaining the upper hand over the squire. Bazan, meanwhile, noticed that the protagonist's swordsmanship had changed, as if he had been holding back all this time. He didn't understand how he could even wield a sword, and tried to stay more focused. Aiden had already forgotten that the previous owner of this body lived a lazy life, so he was weak and without muscles. However, he was still the king of dragon slayers, so he was not going to give up. He landed a few more powerful blows, winning, and remarked that Bazan should give up. The other knights were shocked by this outcome, and Aiden meanwhile approached Karl and thanked him, since sparring was refreshing for him. He pretended to be happy to hear this, but in reality, he was not. Soon the protagonist left, but he was going to come to the training more often. Karl doubted that this was really the same person he knew, and this question was asked not only by him, but also by the other knights. When night came, MC was sitting on the bed, his whole body shaking from fatigue. He couldn't believe this outcome, but he still smiled, since he was able to vent his frustrations, and it was also a new opportunity for him. The heavens had given him another chance in life to take revenge, but his former comrades were so talented that they could be called a one-man army, and given their high status, it wouldn't be easy. Among them were the Night King and heir of the Sias Grand Duchy, Silbeda Sias, the iron-blooded saint chosen by the Slaughter Cult, Lista, the Great Mage, Shaura, and the second commander-in-chief of the Immortal Empire and the Great Alchemist, Calcius. He didn't stand a chance against them now, especially if he had to fight them alone. In order to take revenge, he had to destroy them before they joined forces, since once that happened, the country would be in trouble. He had 5 years left before he could form the coalition to subdue the Dark Mages, and in order to prepare, he needed to start by trying to level up this body, since in this state he wouldn't be able to defeat even one goblin, let alone his former comrades. And so he chose a method that would help him accomplish this task. He soon handed Philip the grocery list, and he was surprised by it. The fact that the protagonist had been quiet until now made him wary, and he wanted to know what he was going to do. The protagonist didn't understand what was wrong with it, and he explained that these were expensive ingredients, even if he bought a top-quality holy potion. In addition, the other ingredients were poisonous plants, and this only terrified him more. But even if Aiden explained this, the others would still doubt it, so there was nothing else to do. He knew that the owner of this body had probably done something like this before, so he leaned towards Philip threateningly, warning her that it was dangerous to know the purpose of these ingredients. He offered to tell him and accept the consequences, and he became more and more afraid with each word. In the end, he ran out of the room to buy all the things he needed right away. MC decided to use everything he could in this life, and although he would not have thought of such things in his previous life. But now that he was the son of a duke, it was a different matter. He had already experienced a body that had transcended mortal limits as a swordmaster, so he would be able to reach this level faster than anyone else. This method was far from normal, but it was effective, and after a month and a half, his body had already changed greatly. He trained and asked Philip for a mana potion. After he drank it, he returned to training. He would push his body to the limit with training and then restore it with a mana potion, and he called this method of breaking and then healing. A single potion was very expensive, but the protagonist's current situation made this method possible. In addition, he had a secret weapon. He asked Philip for these things. It was already in his room, and although Philip was curious about what Aiden was going to do with these ingredients, but the memory of his threatening tone made him curb his curiosity. Soon, the protagonist came to his room, examining the poisonous plants he had obtained. He never thought that he would use this method, but he was going to do it anyway. It was a theory created by Calcius and Shaura, and it was that the body uses everything it can while the poison wreaks havoc, and this allowed the body to survive, revealing its hidden potential. The protagonist could easily die from this. However, he bought a high-quality holy potion to ensure safety. He had already defeated death once, so he ate one of the poisonous flowers, emptying the potion bottle and experiencing the effects of the poison in his body. It was very painful, but he would have to do it many more times. His mana flow definitely became smoother after that, and he knew that this was to be expected from his former comrade's theory. Suddenly, a voice in his head suggested that this was all in good fun, and the protagonist froze as he recognized it. He began calling out to his interlocutor, as he could never forget that voice even if he wanted to. Philip became worried when he heard the noise and ran into the room. The protagonist did not answer him, and he called out to him, and eventually he ordered him to leave. He continued to stay in the room, as there was too much noise, and the protagonist repeated his order, but in a more threatening tone. This time, Philip obeyed, and the MC frowned, as he had definitely heard that voice in his past life. This being knew his real name, but he did not understand why he was here. He ended up falling into the trap of this being, and soon the voice came into his head again, drawing attention to the fact that they had not seen each other for a long time. The appearance of the Demon Lord angered Aiden, and he asked why he was here. Such a question was due to the fact that he clearly saw the death of the Lord. He assumed that the protagonist missed him a lot, and he even felt sorry that he did not have a physical body, so he could not look at him. These words made the protagonist calm down a little, and he wondered how the demon lord spoke to him if he had lost his body. The thing was that, in the end, the protagonist himself died when he became the lord, and he understood that the lord wanted to say that he himself was now the lord of the demons. This was half true, as the demon transferred his soul into MC's body at the time of his death, and he originally planned to take over his flesh and resurrect him. But something went wrong. He assumed that his suicide had failed the plan, and he realized that the demon's soul existed within himself. It could truly be said that way, and the protagonist, without thinking twice, was going to kill that soul. He assumed that he should infuse holy power into his body, and the overlord asked him to listen to him. He continued to ignore him, thinking of ways to kill his soul, and the demon tried to convince him that he was no longer the same as he was in the past. Aiden did not believe it, as he was, after all, a being who loved madness and chaos. In fact, this did not originally belong to the demon, but was caused by the connection between God and the demon. But this connection was severed when the protagonist was trapped in the void. This explained why the monster that appeared now looked calmer than the overlord that MC saw back then. He remembered the appearance of the overlord from his past life, and back then, he was a crazy psycho who couldn't hold a normal conversation. The demon reminded him that he could still hear it, but Aiden wasn't going to apologize for his words, and turned his attention to the demon god, since this was the first time he heard of something like this. The demon god was known as the original sin, and it was a being of pure evil that even the gods feared. In the past, the demon was a being cursed to carry out the will of the demon god. The protagonist understood everything and asked if this situation was also part of the demon's plan. He didn't understand what this situation was, and the protagonist explained that it was a trip back 15 years. Indeed, it could be said that way, since when the demon entered the protagonist's body, it tried to use the dragon mana it possessed to turn back time. Aiden didn't know that such a thing was possible, but the thing was that dragons were created as agents of the gods, and they could interfere with the laws of the world using the power of their dragon mana, so it wasn't that impossible. In that case, the protagonist didn't understand why the demon didn't use it to escape from the void. It was because the monster suddenly felt tired, so it decided to rest for now. It stopped talking to the protagonist, and ignored his request not to leave. Another month passed, and since then, the demon lord occasionally talked to MC. It was disturbing that he was in his body, but he tried not to pay attention to it, because at the same time, he was pleased that someone remembered his past. During this entire time, he did not stop training, and during one of his classes, he broke the dummy he used to parry blows. His training method was effective, so now the dummy would not be enough anyway. He turned his attention to the knights and decided that they would now be his new training dolls. His behavior made the demon think that he really suited their side more than the hero side. He was dissatisfied with these words. While he was training with poisonous herbs, he realized that the holy power in the potion was causing pain to the monster because he was the source of evil. That is why now, when he was dissatisfied with the demon lord's words, he threatened to drink an entire bottle of holy potion, and therefore the monster quickly changed his mind. The protagonist was pleased with his superiority. He came closer to the knights and noticed Law training, remembering that he had seen him somewhere before. The mentor warned Law to be more careful because he was lagging behind the other apprentice knights. He promised him to do better, and finally the protagonist realized that this man was the Free Knight Law. He remembered him from his past life and noticed that he was now very different from this appearance. Law pretended to be a knight despite being a mercenary, and he earned the nickname of a free knight, but now he was here. He certainly had his flaws, which is why they constantly fought, but he still owed his life to him several times. In his past life, there were several S-rank mercenaries, including the protagonist himself, but Lo died fighting a crazy dragon with them. He thought he would see his face in hell, but now he finally felt like he had returned to the past. That was why he stopped training, calling Lo over, and he was surprised by this. Aiden was indignant that he did not address him properly, and he immediately corrected himself, which made the protagonist feel superior. Lo could not concentrate on the battle and was angry because the protagonist began to pester him. Aiden, meanwhile, leaned closer to him, accurately guessing his thoughts. He tried to justify himself, not understanding why he was acting like this, and since he was going to quit soon anyway, he assumed that he should do it now. While he was nervous, the protagonist felt more and more happy when he saw the state of his former rival. Finally, he calmed down more or less, and told Lo to come to his training grounds tonight. He was scared, and Aiden, instead of explaining properly, leaned towards his ear and whispered a few words, which made Lo look at him warily, since he did not understand how he knew it. To the protagonist, such a meeting seemed like fate, and he decided to give Lo a small gift, considering his debt to him. When evening came, he indeed went to the training grounds and waited for Lo, who soon showed up. He was shaking, since the protagonist knew his secret, but there was something more important, and from the realization of this, he could not hold back his tears. This reaction was caused by the protagonist promising that he could heal his arm. In the past, MC Lo had lost his arm. He admitted while drinking with his comrades that he kept thinking that he had become like everyone else. He had abandoned and failed to fulfill his desperate wish in his past life, and Aiden was going to repay the last debt with what he was going to do now, since Lo wished for his right arm to be fine so that he could live like a normal knight. Because of his disability, he was called One-Armed Lo, and the protagonist remembered this. Now, the arm was still there, but it was not healthy, and Lo did not understand how Aiden knew that it was stiff. Even he did not know why his arm was like this, and it turned out that it was because it was affected by mana deficiency syndrome. Lo shuddered, since mana deficiency syndrome referred to all the disturbances that occur in the mana channels. His arm was numb because of that, but the big problem was that this syndrome was incurable. In fact, people said it was, but MC told him that he could cure it. Indeed, the cure was not impossible, but at the moment, no one knew how to do it, and the cure would only be found in about 10 years. He was willing to cure Lo's arm, since he knew the cure, but there was one condition, since nothing was free in this world, and he offered to sign a contract. Lo read the terms of the contract and was amazed, since he had to spar with Aiden every day and also do everything he ordered. It was almost like a slave contract, and the protagonist was not even going to argue with it. Lo could not trust him, since from the very beginning he said that it was incurable, and now he said the opposite. Still, he was sure that he should grab any opportunity, so he decided to accept MC's conditions. He was worried that the day had actually come when he could make Lo his slave. He was going to take another item as a bonus, but he didn't voice it to Lo, who looked wary of his behavior. The demon again noted that the protagonist should be on the evil side, and he shut him up again. A few days later, a carriage passed by in a small town of Maryland, and Lo doubted that this was the place. When Aiden suggested that he doubted him, he gave up on those words, and they rode on in silence until they finally arrived at the right place. The protagonist got out of the carriage, and Lo followed him. He wasn't sure if such a place would cure his arm, but Aiden confidently approached the pharmacy, and Lo noticed the clarifying sign on the door. In the past, he came here to cure his illness, as someone was looking for a cure for mana deficiency syndrome here. In the end, nothing happened, but now the protagonist entered the pharmacy, and Lo assumed that the owner was not there, since the room was empty. He noticed a picture on the wall, and he wondered what was depicted in this picture. It was a philosopher's stone, which was a superstition believed in by magicians and alchemists. It was an imaginary object that interfered with the god's domain, and it could even bring the dead back to life. It was really an absurd idea, but now, considering that MC himself had moved in time, he understood that it was possible. Suddenly, Cassie appeared in the doorway, and she realized that the protagonist was well informed, since few ordinary people knew such a story. He did not explain where he heard this from, but in fact, Calcis and Shaura sometimes talked about it. Meanwhile, Cassie noticed that she had not had such an interesting guest for a long time. But she was not in business. Aiden didn't answer her, but only asked Lo to step outside for a minute. He obeyed without question, and after a short pause, the protagonist suggested that Cassie get straight to the point. He knew her name, and she was surprised, but he again didn't explain anything about it, but went on to tell her that Lo was currently suffering from mana deficiency syndrome. He knew that she was interested in this disease, and also hinted that she was an alchemist of the beast race. She was surprised, but did not deny it, and wondered how much he knew. He himself could not answer this question, but he knew that she was sick too. These words only shocked her more. Her symptoms were worse than usual, and without the leaves of the herb she smoked, her condition would only get worse. Law's condition stopped at his arm, but it was different for her, as the disease had affected all of her organs, and she was now gravely ill. She accepted that the protagonist knew so much about her. However, there was one thing he was wrong about, as she had not yet found a cure, so she could not cure Law. The protagonist promised to protect her and support her research in his territory if she cured Law. She reminded him of her earlier words, but he interrupted her words and handed her a piece of paper with writing on it. She was surprised, but still read it, and eventually realized that it was a cure for mana loss syndrome. Calcis had talked about it so much that the protagonist remembered it, but he didn't remember it perfectly, so he sought out Cassie so that she could understand him even with incomplete information. Now it was actually possible to find a cure. and she only asked for half a month to make it. It turned out that the protagonist had really figured her out. Still, with her resources, it would be difficult for her to get the listed medicinal ingredients, and she realized that he wanted something in return. He asked for her ring, and she found it very ugly of him. In fact, he knew the true purpose of this ring, and Cassie assumed that in that case he must also know how important it was to her. The Ring of Speed was the second reason he came here, as it increased physical speed 3 times for 10 seconds 3 times a day. This item was useful for surprise attacks, escapes, and during battle, and thanks to this artifact that Law received as a keepsake from his past life, even with one arm, he was able to obtain rank S. The ring was the only means of defense for Cassie with her physical limitations, but he promised to protect her, and in that case, she would no longer need such a thing. She was not against this deal as long as she could continue her research, but she doubted that the protagonist was confident in this, since rumors would spread that he accepted a female beastman in the Duke's house. Still, he was known as an honorable scoundrel, so he did not care what people would say. Cassie smiled, since she found him to be a very interesting person. In the end, she agreed, handed him the ring, and he promised her a room and board, which would be better than here, although she would have to earn trust in order to continue their cooperation. Soon they arrived at the Duke's mansion, and at first Aiden was awkward, but now he felt at home here. Before they could go any further, Philip came closer, desperately calling out to the protagonist. He was wondering what was going on, and it turned out to be a very urgent matter. MC didn't understand what was going on, and in the end it turned out that Carl had gone missing on Monster Mountain, and this news shocked Aiden very much. 2 days ago, there was a report that a person had gone missing on Monster Mountain, and Carl had gathered an investigation team and set out, but he had not returned yet. Monster Mountain was supposed to have only minor monsters, and MC asked what was going on with the search party. They were supposed to leave soon, and the protagonist thought about it, because if Carl disappeared, he would have to take the place of the heir, and in that case, all his plans for revenge would be ruined. He was going to save him and join the search team, so he asked Philip to take Cassie to her room. He was very surprised, but MC was not going to explain anything and made a request to her. A little later, he was standing next to Freed and asking for permission to join the search party. However, he refused. The thing was that Carl and dozens of knights had disappeared at the same time, and it was not a simple missing person case. Freed could not send the protagonist to such a dangerous place. Aiden turned on the actor and began to cry, terrified of what would happen to him if something happened to Carl. His behavior touched Freed, and he did not even suspect that in fact the protagonist was doing all this in order to save his plan. The demon found his behavior a little disgusting, but he simply ordered him to shut up. In the end, Freed hugged him, allowing him to go, but he warned him to be careful. He also turned to Spiel and asked him to take care of Aiden. He agreed to this, but he was not happy, so he was sure that all this would only cause more trouble. Soon they arrived at the Mountain of Monsters and realized that the previous search party had been attacked, and their tracks had disappeared from here. One of the blades lying on the ground was a goblin weapon, and the protagonist was sure that there were too many strange things here, since Carl and the knights had lost to simple goblins, and these low-intellect monsters had begun to erase their tracks. There was only one explanation, and that was that the Goblin King, the Hobgoblin, had appeared here. This monster had intelligence and strength on a different level than normal goblins, and if it really was a hobgoblin, all of this was possible. He voiced his guess out loud and decided to prepare in that case, and then return. However, time was of the essence now, and if they delayed even a little, all of the humans would be eaten. He asked for a search dog, but they had already called for search dogs, but the scent had completely disappeared. Spiel suggested trying something else, but MC ordered him to quickly bring the dog. Soon his order was already carried out, and he took out a potion, pouring it into the animal's mouth. Everyone was horrified by his actions, however, nothing terrible happened. On the contrary, the dog was able to catch the smell. He gave the dog a potion to enhance his sense of smell, and he was glad that he asked Cassie to buy it before leaving, since in his past life it was useful to him for search missions. Now they followed the search dog, and soon arrived at the Goblin Village. Spiel drew the protagonist's attention to the fact that Carl and the other knights were in a cage in the village. They were still alive, and this meant that they were not late. But something was wrong, since there were 3 hobgoblins in this place, but there could not be 3 leaders in one village. This was more serious than Spiel thought, and he warned everyone to be ready to give it their all, as the goblins were not inferior in strength even to worthy knights. After that, he turned to Aiden to save the hostages and escape with them. He agreed to do so, but thought about the fact that there were 3 leaders here. Still, such a number of knights should have managed without him. Soon the knights had already drawn their weapons and ran to attack, and the goblins were also ready. The knights were angry that the monsters attacked Carl, and Spiel was going to destroy them all. At this time, Aiden approached the cage, and the captured people rejoiced when they noticed the knights. He opened the cage, and the joy of the inhabitants was replaced by surprise when they recognized him. Even Carl was shocked, and soon the protagonist freed everyone, warning that the knights would provide support. They themselves needed to escape from here quickly, and he himself was also thinking of leaving. Carl did not go out after him, since there was a monster here. The protagonist didn't know what he was talking about, and warned that the monster was right behind him. The huge monster was indeed standing next to him, and was about to strike. This raised dust in the air. But MC jumped aside in time and realized that he had omitted that the reason there were 3 goblins in the village was because there was a creature of a higher rank than the hobgoblins, and it was the most feared monster among the humanoid demons. The protagonist ordered Carl to take the villagers and run away first, but he wasn't going to do anything because he was sure that the protagonist would die. He knew that he wouldn't die because he was the older brother. And Carl didn't like this argument because he still thought that Aiden was just a scoundrel. Even though the protagonist spoke so confidently, he still knew that there was one problem. He ran towards the troll, dodging the blow from this one, and cut the monster's leg. However, the wound healed almost instantly, and because of this regenerative power, the protagonist would not be able to defeat the troll with his usual strength. However, he had something else. And at the moment when the monster was about to attack him, he activated the Ring of Speed. All this happened very quickly, so it was only at this moment that the knights finally noticed that a troll had appeared here. Spiel asked Aiden to let him deal with the monster, since the hobgoblins were no longer such simple monsters, but there was also a troll here. He begged the protagonist to wait a little longer, but he did not have time to do anything. Since the troll attacked the protagonist again, he had taken the ring from Cassie in advance, just in case, and was now happy about it and used the ring to win. In this life, he had not yet reached a certain stage of development, but with this ring, everything was possible for him now. The 10 seconds of the ring's effect were quickly running out, but MC quickly ran around the monster, inflicting many cuts on it. The next stage he had to overcome was equal to such an art. And when only 1 second remained, he charged the blade of the sword with energy and cut off the troll's head with one blow. Finally, some of the monsters that the knights were dealing with were finished, and they were going to help the protagonist, but did not have time to do so, since he had already finished the battle. Spiel noticed Aiden's energy, and he realized that it was the aura of the sword, which even he himself had not mastered. However, despite such a seemingly easy victory, MC did not feel very well and fell, entangled in the branches of a tree. His entire body was aching from the effort, and it was no longer moving, even though he had only used the sword aura for 10 seconds. This meant that he had to be careful when using the Ring of Swiftness, but it was still definitely effective. The protagonist was unable to climb down from the tree himself due to fatigue, so the knights came closer to him. The next day at the mansion, Fried understood everything from the report of the situation that had happened. He thought it was terrible that so many people had suffered, and he was going to give the maximum compensation to the families of the deceased and the injured. Spiel agreed to carry out this order, and Fried turned his attention to another event and asked if it was true that Aiden had defeated that troll. It was indeed so, and Fried even began to doubt that this was really the son he knew. That night, the protagonist sat on his bed, training his mana. Because even if it was only a moment when he used the sword aura, he felt his mana reserve increase. This time, he realized that he was still weak, so he decided to become even stronger in order to win. The Demon Lord really liked this determination, and when he managed to take physical form, the protagonist was surprised, and the demon laughed, confirming that it was really him. However, the monster's appearance was not that threatening, and so the protagonist could not help but laugh, which made the demon very annoyed. However, MC still did not pay attention to him and continued to laugh. In the end, the monster explained that it was because the protagonist was so weak. He was curious about how the demon showed itself, and it turned out that only he could see it, since they were one. When the protagonist became stronger, the demon could also show itself to such an extent. He did not like the fact that he would be able to see the demon from now on, and the monster found this attitude rude towards his savior. The protagonist finally calmed down and began to reason, realizing that the being in front of him was no longer a demon lord, and so he wondered what his real name was. However, he had long since lost his name, and now he simply existed. In this case, MC decided to call him Curse, since he was a curse placed on himself. The demon thought that this was too stupid, but Aiden simply ordered him to shut up. Curse realized that he really was not stopping, and eventually allowed him to say whatever he wanted. In this way, they talked for some time. A week later, the protagonist approached Cassie's room and asked her if everything was going well. She called him Mr. Troll when she noticed him. This nickname irritated the protagonist since all the people called him that because he killed a troll. But Cassie, unlike the others, meant that he looked like a troll, and he did not like it. Eventually, he got distracted and asked where Lo was. He was inside the room, and MC walked to the part where Cassie had pointed him. He called out to Lo, who was crying with joy as his arm was now moving. He knelt down in front of the protagonist, thanking him for curing him. Although he was only a worthless being, he vowed to dedicate his entire life to him. He happily accepted his vow, gloatingly deciding that from now on, he would work for him as a slave. After that, he turned his attention to Cassie, assuming that she had also been cured. But she couldn't do that, as her mana deficiency syndrome was a bit unusual. She needed to study it for about a month, and the protagonist understood everything and praised her for her good work. She was sure that it wasn't her fault, it was all thanks to the meth they told her. She called him a nickname again, which he didn't like, and this time he wasn't going to hide his irritation and suggested that Lo leave, since they had work to do. He enthusiastically agreed to any task, but soon after he was shaking, since MC chose physical labor for his first task. He begged for someone to save him from this. He was already very tired after completing this task. In the meantime, Aiden came to the merchant, who greeted him and drew attention to the troll they dragged. Considering the state of it, it could be said that the monster would sell well, since it was a rare material. The protagonist wanted to use the proceeds from selling the troll to buy certain herbs, and the man said that it would be possible to do so, since their guild had everything. However, when he read the name of the required rites, he realized that they were poisonous plants. And yet the protagonist continued to insist on his own, and in the end the man could not stand his oppression and agreed, since no one knew what could happen if he went against his will. Soon, he and Lo were back at the estate, and the protagonist was happy with the easy money, since it was good. The mercenary habits in him did not change, and even Curse noticed this. Soon, Philip blocked the MC's path, who explained that Freed was waiting for him. He approached the necessary office, entered inside, but froze, since, in addition to Freed, Tirid Sadis was also in the office. He did not like the fact that he was there, but Tirid interpreted his expression differently, realizing that the rumors that he killed the troll were true. He was pleased to meet him, but the protagonist did not answer, since he remembered how rude Tirid was to him in his past life. He had no pleasant memories of him, and he knew him, albeit only a little, and in his mind he was an old man who looked down on mercenaries. In the end, he replied that it was nice to meet him too, and greeted Tirid. He was surprised when he realized that he knew about him, and Aiden confirmed this, as he was one of the few in the Empire who had reached the Swordmaster stage. This was a transcendental stage that all knights dreamed of. Those who surpassed talent and entered the superhuman stage could cut through mountains with their swords and make the air tremble with their breath. MC himself had been one of these people in his past life, and this was the stage he was about to reach again. Tirid pointed out that he was very polite, contrary to rumors, but Freed knew that he still had a lot to learn. After that, he changed the topic and pointed out that Tirid had left his territory, even though it had recently been attacked by orcs. But it wasn't just their territory, as suspicious movements were detected in the Slaughter Tower in the Death Wasteland, which was run by the Slaughter Cult. The protagonist also had business there, as Spica lived there, and he was going to get to her soon. Tirid, meanwhile, concluded that the unusual movement of monsters was happening in 3 different places at the same time, and he didn't think it was a coincidence. It was indeed strange, and that was why they were going to form an investigation team. Freed agreed with it, but Tirid wanted to ask more than that, and invited Aiden to join his knightly order. Both Freed and the protagonist were shocked by this, and Tirid explained that he had heard a lot about the protagonist, as he had reached the Sword Aura stage in less than half a year of wielding a sword. He thought it was nonsense, but when he met him, he realized that it was actually not so. He was going to make him the greatest swordsman in the Western continent, and Freed tried to stop him. But he would not listen to his objections, promising to take care of the protagonist. He asked him for his decision, and he said that he would refuse. Tirid reminded him of the status of the Sadis Knights, as it was one of the most famous knightly orders in the Empire. However, the protagonist was confident that he could become a master swordsman on his own. The thing was that he had already passed this stage in the past, so it was only a matter of time before he could achieve it again. He became more serious, as even if he fought Tirad now, he could at least scratch him. He was outraged by such a bold proposal, and it seemed very rude to him. Fried was horrified by Aiden's words, and Tirad meanwhile began to exude a magical aura. Admitting that MC was funny, the fear mastery he used was the ability to make even the air tremble with a murderous aura, and the protagonist expected this from a swordmaster, but he still managed to resist the effects of it. Tirad himself could not believe that he was holding on, and in the end, he asked if he was sure that he could stand by his words. It was, and the protagonist proposed to make a bet, which surprised his interlocutor even more. The thing is that Tirad always had a weakness for bets, and the protagonist was going to join the knightly order if he could not give Tirad a single scratch. However, if he won, he wanted to get Tirad's sword. He asked again, and it seemed like he was annoyed, but he actually laughed since the protagonist wanted his family heirloom. It turned out that he was completely different from Fried. But he did not respond to this statement, since he passed out from the mastery of fear. Tirad eventually decided to accept the bet, and Curse realized that MC had been aiming for this sword from the beginning. He was going to get it when the opportunity presented itself, since it was one of the legendary swords. Once again, Curse assumed that the protagonist was actually on the evil side. It wasn't long before Tirad and MC were standing opposite each other on the training ground, and when Aiden noticed Tirad's weapon, he was surprised that he was going to use an ogre-killing sword against goblins. This was because Tirad did not know whether his opponent was a goblin or an ogre. Still, it was the knight's duty to give it his all. This attitude irritated MC, as it had not changed in the past or in the present. There were two conditions for the duel, and both of them had to not use the aura blade, and Tirad did not move his right leg. It might seem unfair, but for the swordmaster, it was not even a hindrance. If the protagonist thoughtlessly rushed at him, he would immediately lose. In the end, Tirad suggested to begin, since there were already enough spectators around them. Aiden agreed to this and jumped up from his seat. His speed even surprised Tirad, but he easily stopped his blow. The fact that the protagonist aimed straight for the neck meant that he had been in a real fight. But he did not respond to the provocations, but only noted that he knew that Tirad would block this attack. He expected that it would be too easy for Tirad, but he rushed to attack again. This swordplay was very unusual, and it reminded him of the mercenary style, so he was going to fix it if MC joined their knightly order. The demon now saw what kind of relationship they had, and Aiden meanwhile lost control, as he was irritated by Tirad's dismissive words. He offered him to deal with the mercenary's mediocre swordsmanship, and ran forward again. He used his special skill of the mercenary king, called the Knight's Breakthrough, and so, despite how smug Tirad was, the protagonist managed to abruptly change the trajectory of the blow, and his opponent himself was surprised by this technique. Still, he managed to dodge, but his confusion made MC very happy. The rest of the spectators of the duel were shocked, as he now moved forward, and this confirmed the rumors that he defeated the troll. Even though Tirad's fatigue had caused great losses, he was a master of the sword, and so Fried didn't know if he could say that Aiden could handle him. Tirad was still shocked, and the protagonist began to attack him more and more often, like this unexpectedly. He didn't understand what kind of strange swordsmanship this was, as it was chaotic, but precisely aimed at vital points. It was incomprehensible, and he wanted to take the protagonist with him more and more. He swung his sword, and the protagonist only managed to dodge this attack at the last moment. He noticed that Tirad was simply swinging his sword, and Curse warned that he would be cut in half if he tried to block this strike. In order to be safe, MC jumped back, and Tirad took advantage of this small respite, noticing that he was using an interesting sword technique. Still, this was all he had, and he was sure that he would not be able to defeat him like this. But the protagonist was still standing, so he asked Tirad to continue. He was glad that Aiden did not disappoint him, and welcomed him to his knightly order in advance, and Tirad thanked him in advance. They took up their fighting positions again, and the protagonist immediately jumped up from his place, striking Tirad with his speed. He dealt a lot of blows and distracted Tirad with this, after which he jumped behind him and cut him. He was deceived, since the protagonist hid his skills, and now he realized his victory and promised that he would treat Beelzebub well. No one understood what it was, and some did not even believe that it was over. However, when the realization finally reached them, they began to happily greet the protagonist. He himself was glad that he won, but Curse reminded him that he used the ring. The fact that MC didn't care about this made the Demon Lord doubt his suitability to be a hero or a dragon slayer once again. The protagonist himself didn't understand why he was so nervous, and offered to give him the holy potion again. Curse quickly changed his mind, but called him a cheater. Eventually, the protagonist was forced to stop arguing with him, as Tirad came closer to him and admitted that he hadn't disappointed him. He hid his skills, and so Tirad knew that he was an unusual opponent. MC himself was sure that it was just luck, but even pretending to be modest, he was quite impudent. The protagonist found it surprising that Tirad only had a scratch on his body, although he was going to cut off his arm. Tirad was not going to back out of the deal and handed him his sword. He thanked him for this, happy that he had hit the jackpot. The curse called him a cheater again, and the protagonist warned him that he was asking for it. Soon he was back in his room and looked at the weapon more closely, and the demon congratulated him. This sudden change in mood alarmed the protagonist, and the reason for the curse's amusement was that MC did not know how to use this sword correctly. He was surprised, and it turned out that the demon knew the secret of the legendary swords, which people did not know. The protagonist assumed that this could be a curse, and the demon warned that he would not tell about it for free, but he could share this knowledge if Aiden swears to serve him and never force him to drink the holy potion for the rest of his life. However, the protagonist no longer listened to him, but ran his finger along the blade of the sword, causing a cut on his hand and staining the weapon with blood. Thanks to this, he made a blood contract, and this action amazed the demon lord. The protagonist actually knew all of this, and he remembered that Beelzebub was one of the legendary 72 swords that looked like simple and sturdy blades on the outside, but were actually created from the bodies of corrupt lords who once ruled the ancient underworld. It was only much later that it was revealed that they were cursed swords, each containing the power of a different corrupt lord. One of the 3 conditions for awakening the hidden power was to make a blood pact. Knowing this disappointed Curse, as he could have won the first time, the protagonist had no intention of serving him since he was dead, and he suggested that he prepare to drink 1 holy potion a day. The demon lord became submissive again, and the protagonist was about to fulfill the 2nd condition for awakening the sword. The next day, he entered Freed's office, wanting to join the Tirad search party. Freed knew he was strong, but this quest was dangerous, so it was hard for him to give permission. In the end, the protagonist used the argument that he would go with Tirad, but Freed was still hesitant. Tirad told him not to worry, as he was going to ensure Aiden's safety, no matter what it took. He still hesitated, trying to dissuade MC. He understood everything, but reminded him that this investigation was for the safety of their territory, so he wanted to go too. Tirad sided with him and asked Freed to give permission, as it was very brave for a son to stand up for his father. Freed was still hesitant despite the persuasion, but Aiden was happy with Tirad's words, as they were great words. In his past life, he himself was useless, but this time he was going to prove his worth. Curse realized that this was all for the sake of awakening, since the 2nd condition for awakening the sword was to absorb a huge amount of life force into it. And the protagonist was happy that he would be defeating monsters to achieve this goal. He suggested that the monsters just wait, and the expression on his face seemed terrifying to the demon lord, and so he felt sorry for the monsters. Around this time, in the Pyrenean Mountains, a large number of different monsters were running through the forest, which, however, acted more or less in harmony and shouted to each other to hide from the larger monsters pursuing them. Sometime later, the knights arrived at Attila's fortress, built to protect against the demonic monsters of the Pyrenean Mountains. However, the protagonist doubted that this was really the case, because the room and the soldiers were in complete disarray. At this rate, they would not be able to cope with even 1 horde of goblins, and so he did not understand how they would hold back the attacks of the monsters. Doswald Tiemann welcomed them to the fortress and introduced himself, addressing Tirad and Aiden in turn. When the other knights heard the protagonist's name, they recognized him and began to talk about it, also paying attention to the rumors that he killed a troll. They spoke of him very disparagingly, and Lo became angry, going to stand up for MC's honor, but he stopped him. This seemed unusual even for a demon, since he remained calm after hearing such words. A fight would not lead to anything good, and the protagonist himself had heard this so many times that it no longer angered him. However, Tirad could not help but notice this, and so he assumed that because the air here was so fresh, there were a lot of bugs here, which made a lot of noise. He looked menacingly at Doswald, and he agreed with this, and the knights hesitated. Such behavior of Tirad pleased the protagonist, since he definitely knew how to annoy other people. Sometime later, they were walking along the defensive walls, and Doswald told them that he had heard news that there had been monster attacks in every territory. The protagonist wondered if something had happened here, but their fortress didn't need to worry. The protagonist doubted it, and Tirad realized that there was no danger if the monsters lived right in front of the fortress. Doswald explained that it was because the orcs had settled in the center of the mountain range, and that was why the monsters didn't come down to the territory. MC assumed that his words about the monsters keeping other monsters at bay were some kind of nonsense. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to Curse, who was sure that something big was coming. Aiden wondered what it was, since he couldn't see anything. But suddenly, he saw the monsters approaching and warned Daswald about it. He wasn't sure about his words and assumed that he was joking. Still, Tirad ordered him to close the gate, and he was amazed that even he sided with Aiden. But the next moment, the ground shook as a wave of monsters approached. The monsters ran out of the forest in a huge crowd, and the knights trembled in fear when they noticed these monsters. They did not understand what to do, and Daswald could not orient himself either. In the end, Tirad took control and ordered the knights to close the gate first. They obeyed, but because they did not react immediately, one monster managed to break through the gate and was already preparing to attack one of the soldiers, but the protagonist managed to destroy it in time. Beelzebub absorbed the energy of the slain wolf, but it was not enough to change anything. But nevertheless, the sword sucked out life energy well. Meanwhile, the soldiers were amazedly discussing MC's action, since he just used the sword's aura. In that case, they realized that the rumors about him were true. When the demon heard about the rumors, he again reminded the protagonist of his nickname, the Trollmaster, and he became angry again. Everything the demon lord said disgusted him, but he could not argue with Curse any further, because the knight thanked him for saving him. The protagonist offered him to protect the wall instead of praising him. He obeyed, and at that time, Lo ran closer to Aiden, worried about his condition. He answered his question, but offered him to look at the monsters trying to break through the gate. There were a huge number of these monsters, and the protagonist decided that from now on, these monsters would be his daily snack. The way his expression changed scared Lo. And MC turned to Beelzebub, assuming that it also wanted to eat monsters. And suddenly he froze, not understanding what he was saying. It was because he too could not resist the influence of this sort of gluttony, which sucked out the gluttonous instincts of its owner. The Curse liked to hear Aiden's true feelings, and he felt embarrassed, realizing that he needed to be more careful. But if he was here to awaken Beelzebub, then he was going to gratefully absorb all this life energy. However, he did not have time to engage in battle, as Tirad warned him that he would return after cleaning. The protagonist wanted to deal with everything himself, but Tirad did not listen to his objections and jumped up, swinging his sword. He decided to take out all these monsters in one go, and the knights were shocked when they noticed his aura blade art, which only a swordmaster could use. While they watched him in admiration, Aiden was in despair, begging him to leave him at least a quarter of the monsters. However, Tirad destroyed all the monsters with a few blows. Finally, he laughed, as he was glad that he used his power properly, although he had not done so for a long time. The protagonist was still disappointed, and at that time, Daswald came closer to them, thanking them for their help, as they were able to fight off the monsters without much damage. At that time, Curse called out to MC, and he assumed that he had come to mock him again. However, what the demon lord had spoken of earlier was not a wave of monsters, and the protagonist, still immersed in his sadness, did not immediately understand what he was talking about. The demon repeated his words, and this time Aiden was already more focused, starting to think about what it could be. And suddenly he was amazed, as he noticed a huge fireball flying towards the fortress, and he warned everyone to leave. The fireball exploded, and no one understood what was happening. Even Tirad was amazed by a fire spell of such a scale, and assumed that a mage was targeting them. In fact, this assumption was wrong, and even the demon was surprised that the protagonist knew what kind of creature it was. He understood that it was the monster he had met in his past life, and because of this, he almost went to heaven, so he could not forget this monster. Curse was not sure that the protagonist could really go to heaven, but he explained to him that he was just speaking figuratively. The monster gradually approached the fortress, and the knights were horrified by the fact that so many monsters were together. It turned out that orcs and trolls had united into one army, so the knights had to be ready. Although they did not understand how the trolls of the wasteland and the orcs of the Pyrenean mountains could unite, because they were always at war with each other. Tirad himself wanted to step forward to join the battle, but Aiden warned him that it was too difficult for him alone. He repeated his words in confusion, and MC suggested that he look at the very end of the horde. He noticed a monster towering over the other monsters, and was amazed by it. It was a monster with magical power, and might comparable to a swordmaster, namely the Supreme Troll. Tirad, realizing the seriousness of the situation, told Daswald and Aiden to evacuate the people, and he himself was going to buy them some time. He had already concentrated an aura near himself, but the protagonist stopped him, as he believed that there was still a way out. He did not understand how he could fight a creature that even he himself found difficult. The protagonist asked Lo to lead the soldiers and hold back these monsters with all his might, and he readily agreed and immediately ran forward. Tira didn't understand what MC was planning, as the High Troll alone was a match for the Swordmaster, and that meant Aiden couldn't handle it. He knew this, because the moment the High Troll created an army of trolls, the difficulty of subduing it tripled. Even if Tyrad went to fight it alone, he wouldn't last long. But there was one way for them all to survive, and since they didn't have much time, he was going to explain it briefly. He quickly explained everything, and Dosvald, who heard the plan, screamed in horror, as it was ridiculous. If Tyrad left now, this place would turn into ruins within 30 minutes, and he didn't even have time to finish speaking, as another fireball damaged the fortress. Tyrad also didn't immediately agree with the protagonist's plan, as his words were absurd. He himself understood this, but it was the only way out, and since they didn't have time, he wanted Tyrad to believe him at least once. He remembered his behavior before and smiled, still amazed by him. This time he decided to trust him, but warned him that he would have to join his knightly order if he was wrong. This was expected from a person obsessed with gambling, and so the protagonist agreed to this condition. Tyrad jumped up and disappeared, and the Demon Lord meanwhile asked MC why he was sure that this was the same supreme troll he encountered in his past life. The thing was that the orcs and the trolls hated each other very much, and yet the only one who was able to subjugate and rule the orcs was this creature. And this happened through the use of extremely brutal methods. The monsters had already entered into a fight with the knights, and Lo ran forward, cutting off the head of one of the monsters. He became strong enough to kill the trolls, and this meant that the herbs that the protagonist gave him worked. This unusual method really worked, but these trolls could not be killed just like that. And the monsters led by the Supreme Troll were not called an immortal army for nothing. This was because the Supreme Troll could restore the severed body parts of the defeated monster. And although the knights were already happy with their victory, the monster was resurrected, and the Supreme Troll could do this all the time. Usually, to destroy such monsters, you would need a Swordmaster's Aura Blade or an Archmage's spell. But the protagonist had another way that seemed better to him. He assumed that Beelzebub was very hungry because he had missed his meal earlier, and he promised to give it many trolls to eat. This behavior of the protagonist made even the curse wary, and it seemed to him that Beelzebub was having a hard time. At this time, Law was breathing heavily, stubbornly looking at the huge monster. After consuming the medicinal herbs, he thought that he had become strong enough, but he could not even believe that everything would end like this, because he had not even paid for Aiden yet. The monsters were advancing on him, and he could not kill them. And at the moment when the monster was already swinging its hand to deliver the decisive blow, he mentally apologized to the protagonist. But nothing terrible had time to happen, as Aiden, praising Lo for a good job, jumped on the troll's body and pierced its head with a sword. Lo warned him to be careful, as even if he decapitated the monster, it would not die. The protagonist did not pay any attention to these words, but only warned Beelzebub that it was time for lunch. The sword gradually began to suck the life energy from the troll's body, and although the protagonist did not have the necessary strength to kill monsters, he had the power of Beelzebub's gluttony, and it absorbed the existence of its target. And after such absorption, the target was completely destroyed. This happened with the troll, and even the Supreme Troll was amazed at this event. Trolls turned out to be quite tasty, and one of these monsters had a living force equivalent to 10 wolves. The protagonist turned around sharply, paying attention to the other monsters, and wondered if orcs were also tasty, and he offered Beelzebub to try it too. Soon MC had already killed 4 trolls, but it was still not enough. Trolls were really fuller inside, and no matter how much he ate, he still wanted more. The other trolls were horrified when they noticed his behavior, and the Supreme Troll cast a new magic spell. Aiden managed to dodge several attacks, and he noticed that his opponent was very angry. Instead of running around, it would be nice for him to meet the monster face to face, and in his past life he would have done so. But now, running away was his only option, because if he was even touched by this fire magic, he would be fried. He just needed to wait for Tyrad to arrive, and at that time another monster attacked him, and Curse warned him about it in time, so he managed to dodge the blow. The orcs were really annoying to him, and the demon didn't understand why he didn't just absorb the orcs from the start. While these monsters might not be as good as the trolls, the orcs still had a lot of life force. In fact, it was because the protagonist already had a use for these monsters. If Tyrad had arrived in time, it would have been much more profitable not to kill the orcs. For now, he just had to somehow hold out. Because he was just distracted by the orc, the High Troll managed to launch an attack towards him, and MC was annoyed that it was using its magic again. As the fire settled, the High Troll looked up, noticing Aiden in the air, who had managed to dodge the fire. The monster was now trying to burn everything, be it friend or foe, and without the ring of swiftness.
However, there was something else, and Curse explained that the whole thing was that MC would not be able to avoid the next attack if he was in the air. He was horrified when he realized that the Demon Lord was right, and at that time the Supreme Troll had already directed a new attack towards him. He was sure that he could not die in such a place, but before the fire reached him, Tirad, who had run closer in time, used the aura of the sword, dispelling the magical attack. He noticed that Aiden held on well, and he was glad that he really put out the fire right away. This was expected from the Swordmaster, who was very fast, because he covered such a distance in such a short time. Looking at Tirad, one could say that everything went smoothly. Neither the Supreme Troll nor the orcs understood where another creature came from, which Tirad had brought with him. The situation had changed, but the protagonist did not have time to rejoice for long, because he began to fall. He was horrified when he realized this, and he understood that if he fell now, using all his strength, it would be very bad. However, the orc leader caught him in midair, helping him to fall, and he thanked him for it. The orcs trembled, looking at their lord, and the knights were surprised that the orc had just saved Aiden. The orc meanwhile apologized for not being able to protect the others, and then it offered to take revenge on the trolls who had humiliated them. The other orcs eagerly rushed into battle, and the knights did not understand why the orcs suddenly attacked the trolls, because they had previously been on the same side. Everything happened exactly as the protagonist said, because the Supreme Troll could control the orcs because they used the orcs' loyalty to their tribe against them, and took the chieftain and children hostage in order to control the orcs. However, if the hostages were released, nothing would work, and that is why the protagonist did not recklessly absorb the orcs. The Troll Lord was unhappy that this plan was ruined. Suddenly, Tirad attacked it, but the troll defended itself with fire. It was truly no match for the Swordmaster, and if Tirad was alone, it would not have been able to win, but there were two Swordmasters, and while the troll was distracted by him, the orc jumped closer and damaged it. The High Troll screamed, and Tirad warned it to stop screaming and just die. The troll could not die so senselessly, since it was not going to forgive the people who killed its parents. Flames began to burst out of its eyes and nose, and even Tirad was surprised at what was happening. It was a strange movement of mana, and it was because the High Troll was about to explode all the mana in his body in order to take everyone else with him. Even Tirad could not stop this process, and the knights were unable to withstand the flames. That's why he warned everyone to run, but while the other knights listened to him, MC ran towards the troll, ignoring Tirad's order to get away from there. He smiled excitedly, intending to leave the last blow behind him, and jumped up, preparing to plunge the sword into the troll's body. And soon a powerful explosion was heard, sending waves of fiery energy in all directions. It was time for the main course for Beelzebub, and the sword began to emit magical energy, absorbing the troll's life force. However, the others did not understand what exactly the protagonist was doing, and so they called out to him excitedly. Even Tirad did not know how he was going to deal with such a powerful explosion of mana, and he assumed that he had a plan. However, even the protagonist did not calculate the amount of mana and life force in this troll, and it turned out to be much more than he expected. He no longer thought that Beelzebub would be able to absorb all of this. But he did not leave, intending to wait a little longer. Finally, when the required amount of power was absorbed, he called out to Curse, as he now needed his help. The Demon Lord appeared next to him, annoyed that he was going to use him for something like that. However, he was going to help if MC promised not to drink holy potions for a week. He agreed, as the sword had already absorbed enough life force, and now the last condition for awakening it needed to be met, which was to infuse the sword with demonic energy in order to awaken the evil lord that was sleeping within the weapon. The Demon Lord touched the sword, infusing it with his energy, and commanded the Lord of Gluttony Beelzebub to awaken. The demon sitting inside the sword felt a demonic energy that he had not felt for a long time. He was the will of the Lord of Gluttony, who sought to devour even the sky, and was outraged that someone dared to awaken him. Beelzebub had an overwhelming presence, but MC knew that was to be expected from the ancient lord of the underworld. If he were a normal human, he would have been subdued and turned into a puppet, but he had something that Beelzebub feared the most. That item was Curse, who was not afraid of Beelzebub's threatening presence, but smiled. Beelzebub was afraid when he realized that the Demon Lord was here, and Curse displeasedly ordered him to stop talking and hand over his authority. Beelzebub still couldn't believe that he saw the Demon Lord as soon as he woke up, and Curse reminded him of the handover, annoyed that Beelzebub did not answer him. In the end, Beelzebub agreed, and the protagonist remembered that the Overlord had destroyed all the evil lords, after which he became the ruler of the underworld, and so it was no wonder that Beelzebub was afraid of him. This meant that the curse could also be useful, and he was slightly embarrassed by such praise, but he reminded the MC of his promise with displeasure. He agreed, and after that, he ordered Beelzebub to eat the remains of the troll, and the sword obeyed, starting to suck in not only the energy of the monster but also the body of this one. A strong wind arose, making it difficult not only to stand on your feet but also to see anything. The troll resisted, and so the protagonist ordered it to become his own power. Finally, Beelzebub managed to defeat the monster and absorb it, so everything calmed down. Tirid quickly got his bearings, and immediately became interested in the absence of the supreme troll, while Lo leaned against a tree, unable to believe that they were finally safe. The protagonist was exhausted, but was amazed at the true strength of the Lord of Gluttony's power, as he absorbed a huge amount of life force and mana. But suddenly he felt very sick, and he covered his mouth to keep from vomiting. He ate too much, but it was only his fault. It did not matter how strong the power was, if you abuse it, it turns into poison. And as unfortunate as it was, MC would have to let go of some of this power. But he was going to absorb it, no matter what, and tried to suppress the urge to vomit. Suddenly, he noticed a phoenix nearby, and in this case, it was not surprising that the Supreme Troll used fire magic. The phoenix had fallen into a comatose state as it had been consumed by the Great Troll, and since that species was as rare as a dragon, MC didn't understand how the phoenix had ended up here. But suddenly, he realized that he would be able to use fire magic if he ate it, and Curse reminded him that he was about to vomit from overeating. That was indeed true, but being able to use fire magic was a different matter. The Demon Lord, watching him, understood how reckless human greed could be. However, the protagonist felt no remorse and was about to consume the egg, but at that moment, he was slapped on the back by Tirid, who was glad that he had finally managed to do it. This time, Aiden couldn't hold back anymore, and he vomited right on the phoenix's egg. Tirid was worried about his condition, and Curse, on the contrary, was happy, since the protagonist deserved punishment for his greed. Tirid at this moment finally noticed the phoenix, and he did not understand why such a rare creature appeared here. MC, meanwhile, burst into tears, since he lost part of his mana and life force. That is why he decided to eat the phoenix again. But suddenly, the egg cracked and began to emit more light. The phoenix hatched, flying into the air, and it woke up after accepting the mana that MC lost. The soldiers were shocked, since seeing the phoenix alive was a great success. Even Tirid watched the animal with admiration, and only the protagonist was angry, and in particular his irritation was directed at Tirid, because it was because of him that he missed a chance that happens once in a lifetime. And suddenly, the phoenix landed on his head, and Aiden himself did not understand why this was so. The phoenix enveloped his body in flames, and at first everyone was scared, and even the protagonist was wary, but it turned out that the fire was not hot at all. This was the phoenix's blessing, which gave significant resistance to most types of flames, and since the phoenix was resurrected by absorbing the mana that Aiden had spent, it saw him as its savior. The protagonist remembered Shore and realized that in this case, fire resistance would be useful to him. The phoenix, having finished with the blessing, flew away, and a feather fell from it, which the protagonist managed to catch. Tirid was still worried about his condition, since he had just been burned, but in fact everything was fine. Ever since they met, Tirid had experienced incredible things one after another, and Aiden was as confused as he was, since this was his first experience. Suddenly the chieftain of the orc tribe came closer to them, and since it was still there, MC assumed that it wanted to continue fighting. But that was not the case, since the chieftain broke the oath and decided to pay, offering to let Aiden take its head. The protagonist did not understand what oath the orc chieftain was talking about, and it turned out that a long time ago, the head of the Remus family and the orc chieftain fought a duel for this land, and the orc chieftain lost the duel and swore to return to the mountains and never come down again. After that, monsters settled in the mountains and protected this land, and now the protagonist understood the explanation for Dasvald's words about the monsters not attacking the fortress. Orcs were a race that valued an oath more than their own lives, and so the orc chieftain insisted on paying for the oath with his death. However, the protagonist didn't really want his head, and suggested that the orc just go back. It was still certain that he had to pay for breaking his oath, and the fact that the monster was very noisy irritated the MC. The orcs were protecting their territory anyway, so he figured it was better to be patient and not jump to conclusions. Finally, he came up with something and suggested that the orc chieftain pay him with something other than his head, and the monster didn't understand what he was talking about. The next day, the restoration of the ruined fortress began, and even Tirid wasn't sure what he was looking at. In addition to the knights, the orcs also participated in the restoration, and they were much more efficient than regular soldiers. The orcs and humans worked together, and although the restoration usually took months, thanks to this, it could be done in a week. The orcs protected the life of their chieftain, and the humans got free labor, and it was a win-win situation. Tirid would never be able to understand MC, as it was like talking to a dragon that had been alive for 100 years. Besides that, he suggested that they should leave the matter of the slaughter tower, as it was no longer in their power. The protagonist understood everything, and it was no longer his problem, as he had already gotten what he wanted. Not only had he awakened Beelzebub, he had even received the blessing of the Phoenix, and so now he was going to calmly return home and train some more. When he returned to the city, the villagers happily thanked him for saving their territory. They happily chatted among themselves, discussing the fact that he had fought the Supreme Troll and could control the phoenixes. The rumors that the villagers heard were somewhat exaggerated and altered, and these distortions irritated Aiden, as he hated such superficial greeting ceremonies. The curse did not immediately respond to his words, but mocked him for the flower crown he wore on his head. However, the demon lord quickly calmed down, as the villagers' words were not superficial, and they sincerely believed that MC was a hero. He did not understand what was wrong with that, since it was not money, and it meant that he was truly more suited to being a mercenary than a knight. In any case, this time he really planned to train quietly, and so he did not pay attention to anything else. A little later, he came to Cassie's research lab and was disappointed, as she told him that there was no way to fix it. It was impossible to cure her now, as the mana deficiency syndrome in her body was more severe than she thought. She needed a much more delicate medicine than the one she managed to cure Law with. Aiden was willing to pay any amount for such a medicine, but money was not the main thing, as they needed an alchemist who was skilled enough to create an elixir of the highest class. Such an alchemist could only be found in the imperial court, but Cassie was still grateful to the protagonist, because if she stayed in her pharmacy, she would have died, wasting her entire life searching for a cure. However, he was not going to accept her words, as everything would be possible if they had an alchemist. She reminded him of what she had said earlier, but he knew someone who could help them, so he asked her to just wait here. At first, she had doubts when the protagonist came to her and offered to tell her how to cure mana deficiency syndrome, as well as providing funds for research. Her second stage was acceptance, as she had no choice but to accept Aiden's offer, as her body would not last long. Her third was despair, as she was devastated by the fact that the method to cure her body was incredibly difficult. But now, her feelings had changed, as the people she had met so far had warm words but cold actions. But with Aiden, it was the opposite. She hadn't felt such warmth in a long time, and so she asked him to bring her an experienced alchemist, crying with joy, as her research was perfect. He was actually going to do so, and Curse was amazed that he would do this for someone else. A sudden change in a person could be fatal, so he was worried about the protagonist's condition. But he was just fulfilling a promise, and this was very important for mercenaries. Besides, he was still going to visit this alchemist soon, because he did not have much time left. 3 days later, the protagonist arrived in the city of Markellan, which was a large trading center. It was a very lively city in the past, and since he used the past tense, Curse was interested in the story of it. In this city, everyone worked tirelessly, but the city itself disappeared due to the attack of a mad dragon. MC was the only one who found this story strange, and the demon changed the topic, remembering the alchemist they needed. The protagonist was going to find a way to this person, so he simply ordered the demon lord to shut up. At the same time, in the outskirts of the city of Markellan, in the slum area, several people surrounded Joseph and began to threaten him, as he had to prepare the goods by today. But it would not work, no matter how fast he worked. However, the men were sure that it was not their problem, and they warned him to be careful, as he could get hurt if he did not comply with their conditions. He was terrified, but could not resist, and at that time, Aiden entered the alley, who was offering a solution for those who suffered from threats, attacks, and blackmail. He shouted out his announcement, and the men were distracted by him, and one of them ordered Charon to go and take care of him. Charon approached the MC, trying to find out what he was doing there. He did not answer him, but asked if he did not know who he was. Charon ordered him to get lost, but Aiden ignored him and turned to Joseph, assuming that he needed his services. Charon got angry because he wasn't paying any attention to him and swung his arm to attack him, but the next moment, MC himself threw him into the wall. Charon's comrades were worried about what happened, and the protagonist told him to back off, as he noticed his client. Another bandit attacked him, outraged by his behavior. However, MC easily dodged and ran closer to him, pulling down his pants and starting to laugh at the underwear he was wearing. The man only got angrier, noticing that the protagonist looked like a troll, and he only got angrier, and the man pulled out a sword, intending to destroy him. However, Aiden broke his weapon with his sword aura, grabbed the man and attacked him himself, deciding to fix his eyes. Very soon the man was lying beaten on the ground, but he was still lucky that the protagonist answered him so easily for comparing himself to a troll. He was the first to use Beelzebub like this, but Aiden did not respond to this curse remark. Another man who remained conscious was scared as he watched everything the protagonist did. He meanwhile approached Joseph, offering his services for a reasonable price. And he thought about it, since the awakened one with the sword's aura was offering him help for such a low price. He thought that he might ask for something crazy later, and so he doubted that he could trust him. However, he had no other choice, so he asked him for help. He was a famous alchemist in the underworld of Marcelan, but his daughter was kidnapped by the criminal organization Cerberus Guild, and he could do nothing to stop them. Onkal offered him a deal, since Joseph was an alchemist in an interesting place before. He had to give them pills once a week, and in that case, they were going to protect both him and his daughter Eldest. Considering that this place was very dangerous, the deal was good, and in the past life Joseph brought these pills to the guild for years. But when he found out that Eldest was already dead, he asked the protagonist for revenge, and soon joined his daughter in the afterlife. However, that was in the past life, and this time it was still not too late. Joseph was going to give him whatever he wanted, and asked him to save his daughter. MC agreed, but he decided that Joseph would give him whatever he wanted. Beelzebub noted that the protagonist was the first person who had a stronger gluttony than him, but in the protagonist's opinion, this deal was fair. He eventually turned to the man who was alive, and he stopped in fear. The protagonist spared him for a reason. He had a few questions, but he doubted that his hostage would answer him willingly, and so he decided to start with a few blows, ignoring what the bandit was actually going to answer him right now. A little later in the Cerberus Guild apartment, Onkal was sitting in the guild leader's office, since this time with 2 Joseph pills they should make a profit. He was thinking about taking one of these pills, because it was very good for the body, and suddenly the door to his office opened, and he was indignant that someone dared to enter without knocking. Finally, he recognized his ward and inquired about the pills, but then noticed the man's condition. Soon after, Aiden himself entered inside, and Onkal did not understand who he was, but assumed that the condition of his guild member was related to him. He did not know what he wanted, but he was sure that he was stupid. Since he came to the tiger's den in such a state, he had an artifact for an emergency, and it rang if you pour mana into it. He activated the artifact so his people should arrive soon, and he was sure that Aiden had come to an end. However, nothing happened even after some time, and Onkal assumed that the artifact was broken. The protagonist meanwhile began to approach him closer, and Onkal tried to scream and warn someone about the stranger. MC guessed that he was calling his guild members, but explained that when he came earlier, they were all in a deep sleep. However, he was not going to let Onkal fall asleep just like that, and asked where Eldest was. He guessed that he was a mercenary hired by Joseph, and warned him not to be impudent, since he was the strongest in this guild. He was going to attack him, but after a short battle, he gave in and opened the dungeon in which Eldest was imprisoned. Aiden was outraged that they locked her in such a place, but Onkal explained that Eldest was unusual. As soon as he opened the door, she, despite the fact she could seem calm, she jumped on him, attacking, and from this blow he flew far to the side. Eldest promised to kill him, and the protagonist noted that she was pretty good, and even if he left Onkal beaten half to death, the blow was good. Eldest had a pretty interesting power, and even Kirsch noticed it. She meanwhile tried to attack Aiden, but he easily blocked each of her blows. The Demon Lord noted that her power was similar to that of a very annoying guy, but it was none of MC's business, since his goal was to save Eldest. She wanted to go to her dad, and the protagonist immediately agreed with this, so she calmed down. He explained that he came at Joseph's request to save her, and she was happy that she could actually go home. She hugged him, crying with happiness, as she was very scared and missed her father. MC convinced her that she was okay now, and suggested going home. Kirsch didn't even think that he still had the ability to empathize in his head, and the protagonist was outraged that he thought something like that about him, but Kirsch just seemed to be a little different from how he was in his past life. Very soon, Eldest ran into her house and happily hugged Joseph. They both cried with joy, and MC watched them from the side with a smile. A little later, when Eldest fell asleep, Joseph thanked him, but that was not the end, as now it was time for them to settle accounts. Joseph understood that he had to pay compensation, and he was interested in how much the protagonist wanted to receive. He offered him to answer the question, how much is his daughter's life worth? To Joseph, she was more precious than his own life, and if MC asked for money, Joseph was going to spend his entire life to pay. But he had a lot of money, and he offered to take Joseph's alchemy skills. He became wary when he realized his intention, and it was true, since Aiden needed an alchemist with such skills as possible. Joseph realized that MC helped him because he knew about his alchemy skills, but he had to pay for the help, and so he opened a small box, revealing a pill lying in it. The protagonist had seen it in his past life, and it was the highest grade elixir Joseph could make. He offered MC to try it, and he eagerly touched it, and Joseph was going to make it part of his payment. The protagonist's chin even began to drool in anticipation, and it seemed disgusting to the curse. The protagonist was sure that he was saying this because he hadn't tried this elixir, because if he drank it, his mana would double. It happened almost instantly, and when the elixir wore off, MC realized that it was simply amazing. This elixir was beyond compare, and in that case, as compensation, Joseph was going to continue making these elixirs for him. However, Aiden offered him to join the Duke's family, because if Joseph agreed to this, they would be able to protect both him and Eldest. He didn't understand how he could do this, and finally MC decided to introduce himself, and Joseph was amazed when he realized that he was the troll prince that the whole city was talking about lately. He was outraged by this nickname again, and even Curse realized that the protagonist had a bad reputation. Joseph eventually calmed down a little, and he wondered what brought the protagonist to such a humble place. The thing was that he urgently needed his help, and if he helped him solve this matter, then their duchy would protect his family for life. It was a good proposal, and Joseph actually agreed with it, so he proposed to solve this urgent matter first. Soon, they all arrived at Cassie's research lab, and when Joseph examined her, he realized that this was the most severe case of mana deficiency syndrome he had ever seen. She would have died long ago, if not for the exceptional strength of the beast race. Of course, it could be cured if they made a medicine using the method he saw. But the problem was getting the ingredients needed to make the medicine, and Aiden suggested getting it from his house. But in reality, these ingredients were impossible to get, since mana deficiency syndrome was a disease in which the mana channels become clogged, and to cure these channels, they needed mana with an extreme fire attribute. It could be obtained from things like the fire dragon's heart or the phoenix's feather, but such legendary creatures were impossible to find. Cassie knew that there was nothing she could do, but she was still grateful for their help. The protagonist put his hand in his pocket when he heard about the phoenix's feather and showed it to the others. Cassie and Joseph were shocked that he had something they had only heard of in legends. He remembered how the phoenix dropped the feather, but Joseph did not ask him for an explanation anymore, since it could definitely cure mana deficiency syndrome. He only asked for 2 days, and Cassie could not hold back her tears of joy. At this time, Philip knocked on the lab, and MC wondered why he came. Fried was looking for him, and the protagonist was horrified, since this time he disappeared without saying anything. When he arrived at Duke Fried's office, he was still wary when he asked about his trip to McKellen City. He explained that he went there on business and apologized for not informing him before leaving. But Fried didn't call him to scold him, and the protagonist didn't understand what the reason was for calling him then. The thing was that they had received an invitation to an imperial banquet in honor of the crown prince's upcoming birthday, and this time Aiden was supposed to go. Carl had attended such events before, representing their family. The protagonist himself did not want to go, since he himself was very busy. Carl had indeed represented their family at such events before, but he refused since he had to deal with the knights, and besides, many people wanted to see MC. He initially wanted to object, but suddenly remembered what year it was, and Fried not only confirmed this, but also added that the protagonist should be at this banquet, even if it was unpleasant for him. This time, he did not refuse and agreed to go. Fried was surprised by such a sudden change in mood, but the protagonist assumed that he had no choice if Carl was busy. He was going to go, thinking that it was just an appearance, and Fried was glad that he made the right decision and warned him to be careful on the trip. After their conversation ended, Aiden walked out into the hallway, and Curse realized that he would not go to such a place without a reason. This year, an important event was going to happen at the Imperial Banquet, namely, the attack of Black Mages on the Imperial Banquet. At the center of it all was the Queen of Black Mages, the Silver Witch Nisita Florence, and he was going to attract her to his side. The Demon Lord remembered that MC despised Black Mages, and so he did not understand why he was trying to make an ally out of someone he hated. But unlike the radical heretical group of Black Magicians Chaos, Nisita was the leader of the moderate faction Fire Florence, and although he had finished her off in her previous life, this time it could have ended differently. Even in the past, when she was dying from his attacks, she smiled, as she was sure that they could have become very close if they had met differently. She regretted that she could not fix the corrupted black magic and restore Florence's will. Soon, the protagonist was already heading to the event. He doubted that they needed such a large retinue, and Law explained that the size of the escort symbolized the family's power. However, he wondered why they had to take a detour to go to a village and leave a shortcut behind. Aiden wanted to take a more leisurely route, but what he really wanted was to get more of Joseph's first-class elixirs. But there was one problem, because in fact, even if he wanted to make a top-class elixir now, he couldn't do it because he needed ent tears, which come from the spirit of the trees, as an ingredient for first-class elixirs. However, ents were currently endangered, and it was hard to even find traces of them, let alone their tears. MC had never seen ents either, so he didn't know much about it, but he knew that someone probably knew about it. For now, he decided to take the gift, and when they stopped, he told everyone to go rest, and he was about to leave. Lo wanted to see him off, but he was weaker than the protagonist, so he told him to stay. He was upset, but he agreed, and Aiden went deeper into the forest. Curse doubted that there was anyone to meet in these mountains, but in fact, the protagonist was not looking for a person. Finally, he found the right place, and even now, he couldn't understand what his master was thinking. He looked at the huge heart-shaped stone, and it seemed very artificial to the demon. It was a gift, personally prepared for the disciple who would come someday. The protagonist remembered Valken, who always had very peculiar tastes. It turned out that this strange stone was eating the very gift, but Curse thought it was an ordinary stone. In fact, Valken really liked to wrap things, and MC was going to take the gift this time too. He took out his sword, cutting the stone in half, and the demon lord reminded him that it was a gift from his master. In fact, it was only the outer layer, under which the dungeon was hidden. Valken had always been an eccentric person who believed that a person only became stronger if they overcame a near-death experience or learned through pain. In addition, this was not just any dungeon, but a dungeon ruled by a lich. Curse assumed that MC did not get along with Valken in his past life, but he recalled his mentor's eccentricity. When he entered this dungeon in his past life, he thought that he wanted to kill him, but in this life, he was grateful for the opportunity. The lich was surprised when he noticed the visitor. Such monsters were one of the most difficult opponents if you do not know how to deal with them, and in his past life, these monsters caused a lot of trouble for the protagonist. The lich was sure that he was a stupid person, and was going to turn him into an undead like the rest of the people. However, Aiden was not going to listen to the monster's words and quickly approached it to destroy it, because if he did, the rest of the undead would disappear. Besides, this half-dead lich was nothing, considering the experience of the protagonist in his past life. He destroyed the monster with one powerful blow, which would not be able to see the revival of the kingdom of black mages. Other undead also began to dissolve, and the protagonist suddenly noticed a pendant on the monster's neck. Curse assumed that this was a gift from Valken, but MC had never seen anything like this before. The pattern seemed familiar to him, but he decided not to think about it now and just leave the pendant. The demon advised him to collect lich bone dust, and he was outraged by this suggestion. The thing was that it would turn into a search for ents, and although the protagonist did not want to follow the words of the demon lord, he knew little about ents, so he listened, but warned that Curse should be prepared for the consequences if he tells him to collect this for some strange purposes. He simply asked him for trust, but then remembered the gift, and MC advised him to wait a little. Just a moment ago he was skeptical, but now he was collecting a lot of powder. I was all because storing useful things was great. He went deeper into the dungeon, which turned out to be a secret room. No matter how eccentric Valken was, he was not so crazy as to simply throw MC into a dungeon with one lich. However, just the presence of this monster already seemed crazy enough to Curse. MC asked him to shut up. The demon was surprised, because he noticed the shield that he knew in his past life. If it weren't for this, the demon lord would never have lost the battle against the protagonist. He also hadn't seen this banshee spirit shield for a long time. This item was imbued with the spirit of a mad banshee, and this darkened the user himself, so Aiden had a hard time in his past life. But this was already the second time, so it didn't seem like nonsense to him. One of the reasons he liked the shield was because it could be worn as a bracelet and taken out whenever needed. Because it was a familiar object, it now reminded the protagonist of the time when he was the Dragon Slayer King. Because he was lost in thought, he didn't even pay attention to the mad scream, and Curse assumed that he was crazy too. It was time for them to leave. But there was someone else here. so Aiden warned that he wanted to make a deal. Rabbits appeared next to him from the portal and introduced himself, offering the protagonist just what he needed. Their spirit market had everything, and MC remembered the spirits of trade who had strong monetary desires. The spirit market was created when these spirits gathered together, and the central figure was the Hatter. Usually, when someone cleared a dungeon, the market would send a spirit to exchange for side items from that dungeon, but the protagonist knew about another nuance. Rabbits, meanwhile, suggested that he wanted to exchange a shield, and he could buy it from him for a good price. But he was not going to sell it, and Rabbits did not understand what kind of deal this was in that case. MC wanted to know where the dwellings of the Ents were on this western continent. Rabbits understood that he wanted to buy information, but this information was very expensive, because even if it was the location of a small village, then with a discount it would cost 2,000 gold coins. However, the protagonist offered 4,000 coins, and Rabbits was delighted by this opportunity. Curse did not understand why the protagonist suddenly doubled the price, and he assumed that he owed this spirit something in his past life. But he was just doing what he was taught, and that was the skill of milking the spirits of merchants, which Valken taught him. He had milked rabbits like this in his past life too, and so he wanted to show off his skills in this life as well. That's why he asked Rabbits to give him the location of the Ent's home and 4,000 gold. The spirit was outraged, assuming he was crazy, but in fact MC was offering a trade and wanted to sell Rabbits what was behind him. He was amazed that he knew this information, and the protagonist noted that he could always destroy the core behind his back if Rabbits didn't need it. He remembered how Valken wanted to sell the dungeon core in the past. It was his secret money-making scheme that no one knew about, because the real reason the spirits traders came to the dungeon was for this core. It was useless, and no one would take it even if it was free. And so Aiden was surprised that the spirits wanted to get their hands on it. Valken didn't know why either, but in any case, everything belongs to the person who conquered the dungeon, which means the core can be sold as well. The protagonist assumed that the spirits might not buy it, in which case they could just destroy it. At the moment, he was wondering what Rabbits would do, and he trembled. MC was rushing him, but he still didn't answer. Everyone else was just throwing these cores, so he didn't know what to do now. If he bought this core with money, he would be insulted, but if he didn't return it, he would definitely be fired. In the end, the protagonist got tired of waiting and decided to destroy the core, and then Rabbits agreed to buy it. The protagonist was happy with his victory, and Curse was wondering where he would continue to extort money from. Soon, Aiden already received his reward, assuming that it was a good deal. He suggested Rabbits to meet again sometime, but he hoped that it would not happen. But in fact, he was not so disappointed, since MC could try to find the village of Ents, but no one has returned from there yet. Meanwhile, the protagonist began to return to the carriage. At this time, Lo was worried, since half a day had passed since he left. He was going to go and look for him, but by this time the protagonist returned. Lo admitted his worry, but Aiden asked him to stop, because sometimes he wished that he would treat him as rudely as before. He still could not get used to the changed relationship between them. And in the end, he suggested that they immediately go to the imperial capital. Nisita also appeared at the entrance to the dungeon of the Banshee spirit, who at first was happy that she found it, but then became disappointed, since there was no one here. She breathed heavily and knelt down next to the destroyed Lich, who had disappeared, although he should have been right there. The next day in the imperial capital, a servant met the arriving carriage, from which Aiden came out. He greeted him, intending to lead him to the guest company room, where he would be staying during his visit. Although he smiled, he was still wary, since Aiden had come instead of Carl, and he had a bad reputation even in the imperial capital. They should not offend him, and so he overcame his disgust. Soon the protagonist was already in his assigned room, and he noticed that even the beds in the rooms of the imperial palace were different. Tonight, the black magicians were supposed to cause chaos, and last time there were many people injured and killed. In that case, Curse suggested that he warn these people, but he thought that this was a good opportunity, because he could not easily miss Niset. The Demon Lord thought that he didn't care if people died or got hurt, but the protagonist reminded him that in his past life, he was a hero who saved the world, and he actually had a plan. Soon, as the event began, the nobles began to talk among themselves. The protagonist also arrived at the event, and the atmosphere immediately changed, as everyone knew that he was a scoundrel and believed that his achievements were actually false. It had been a long time since anyone had treated him like this, and the last time he had been treated like this was by the mercenaries in his past life. That was why all people were the same to him. But he didn't care, as there were only 3 people he wanted to meet. He noticed one of them in the back of the room. Gustav Dora tried alcohol, wanting to import it to their magic tower, and at that time Aiden came closer to him, happy to meet him. He was surprised that he knew him, and MC remarked that he was one of the best when it came to Angus. Gustav wasn't going to talk to him if he was trying to gain favor with the Magic Tower country, since he wasn't on good terms with the higher-ups. That wasn't the case, and the protagonist revealed that he had read a book that Gustav had written. He found it interesting, and Gustav became interested, and the protagonist began to praise the book. This amazed Gustav, and he remarked that MC had great insight, unlike the old men of the Magic Tower country. He continued to praise the book, but in reality he fell asleep every time he tried to read it, and never even turned the first page. Gustav began to talk about his assumptions about magic engineering, and even Curse wanted it to end. Aiden suggested that he just pretend that he didn't have ears. But Curse didn't understand the need for someone who was obsessed with magical engineering, which wasn't even magic. In fact, this magical engineering would later become an indispensable technology for everyone. And in that case, Curse guessed that Gustav was quite an interesting person. This was indeed the case, since he caused an unprecedented and grandiose event in history, which is why he was called the mad terrorist of the Magic Tower. The demon couldn't believe it, and the whole point was that Gustav would soon cause an accident during an experiment. His mana would be sealed, and he would be banished from the Magic Tower country. Then he would attack the Magic Tower with a weapon he created himself, and he would become the person who almost destroyed the Magic Tower country. Of course, he was stopped because the Magic Tower country had Shaura, but in any case, thanks to this event, magical engineering gained recognition. Gustav continued talking about his discoveries for some time like this, and when he finally calmed down, he admitted that it was the first time he had such a deep conversation about magical engineering. He thought that he might have said too much because he was excited, but the protagonist calmed him down, although he really didn't like listening to all of this. He even wished that they could talk more the next time they met, but Gustav didn't have time to answer him, because Tian Sadis, who had come closer, called out to MC, and although his face seemed familiar to him, he couldn't remember it. Tian, meanwhile, called him a thief, and he wasn't going to forgive him for stealing their family religion. But the protagonist still couldn't remember him. Gustav assumed that something had happened between them, but MC couldn't answer, since it was his first time seeing Tian. However, he suddenly noticed the last name Sedis, which Tian mentioned, and after that he realized why he seemed familiar to him. He looked quite similar to Tirid, as he was his eldest son. In order to smooth things over, the protagonist smiled and was happy to meet Tian, noting his resemblance to his father. He angrily ordered him to shut up, calling him a cheater, as he still believed that he had tricked Tirid and stolen their family heirloom. He was outraged at being called a cheater, and at this time, the people, attracted by Tian's shouts, began to talk among themselves, paying attention to the protagonist's sword. They realized that he did not defeat the troll himself, but he tried to calm everyone down, as there was a misunderstanding. He won the sword fairly in a bet, and before he finished speaking, Tian interrupted him, and although he had heard a lot about Aiden acting unusually lately, he would never believe that someone like him could withstand Tirid's sword and win the bet. The protagonist continued to smile, but warned that Tian was overdoing it. Kerr seemed surprised that he knew what patience was, and his words made MC suggest that he should hit Tian then and there. Tian became even more angry at his words, challenging him to prove that it wasn't a scam. He was going to kneel and apologize if he lost, but if he won, the protagonist was to return the sword and apologize on his knees. The protagonist felt that Tian was becoming more and more rude, but he was as stupid as Tirid anyway. He found it outrageous that Tian was proposing a duel at the Crown Prince's birthday banquet. At that moment, Mars Immortalia just walked closer to them, finding it funny to announce this duel at his birthday banquet. Tian and MC turned their attention to him, and at that time, one of the knights announced Mars' arrival. Everyone immediately bowed down except for Tian and Aiden, and Mars walked straight towards them. Tian greeted him. The protagonist was annoyed, as Mars' appearance was very untimely. He heard their conversation, and Tian apologized, intending to accept any punishment for causing trouble. The protagonist was sure that the Crown Prince's appearance saved Tian. He apologized as well, but Mars was sure that they should not do that. He asked them to raise their heads and admitted that he wanted to see their duel. He wondered if they would fight here, and both boys changed their words. The thing was, Tian was known for his exceptional fighting skills, and Aiden had recently caused a lot of noise with his exploits. If the two of them showed him their skills, it would be the best birthday present he could wish for. Mars was indeed famous in the protagonist's past life for being considered the best candidate for the post of emperor. But he had the disadvantage of being a battle maniac. He couldn't refuse Mars's offer, so he didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, Tion happily accepted the offer, as Tirid, who had never acknowledged him, acknowledged the protagonist, and although he didn't know what trick MC was using, he was going to expose him and get their relic back, as well as earn his father's recognition. When he noticed Aiden standing next to him shaking, he called him a coward, confident that he had disgraced the family with his actions, and this would serve as a lesson to him. Curse was also worried about the protagonist's condition, unsure if he was okay. He also agreed to the duel, although he didn't like fighting. He sympathized with Tirid, but he had no choice but to accept this duel. And he was going to use this chance to teach Tion some manners. He really didn't look healthy, as he was fighting a child, and so the Demon Lord doubted that he was even human. Soon the two of them were facing each other. And Mars laid down the rules, prohibiting the use of sword aura and artifacts. He was looking forward to seeing what kind of fight they would both show, and Tion promised a fair duel. He was going to prove that all the rumors about MC were nonsense, but he did not react to the provocation but simply yawned and suggested that they begin already. And his behavior irritated Tion, and he was sure that the problem was in the trap. He immediately jumped up from his place to attack, and he thought it was ridiculous that such an amateur as the protagonist defeated Tirid. He was going to finish it quickly and quietly, but before he himself struck, the protagonist hit him in the forehead with his sword, and Tion himself froze in amazement, not understanding how this happened. Mars was surprised, and Diarceus did not even immediately realize that Tion lost so easily. MC explained that he was surprised and slipped, and Tion was just by chance nearby. He was lucky, and he believed that it was difficult to judge skill by a coincidence created by mistakes on both sides, so he proposed to declare this round null and void. Mars agreed with this proposal, telling them both to focus better. Tion agreed with this, angry that he had let his guard down. Even if it was a rude person like Aiden, a knight was still a knight after all, and he should wield a sword. However, he did not understand what it was, as the protagonist's expression as he struck was disgusting. Tion was going to give it his all, and MC agreed with this, telling him to attack already. Tion was becoming increasingly angry at his behavior, but he was not going to let anyone fool him twice. He rushed forward, delivering powerful blows, but the protagonist easily dodged them, despite admitting that Tion's sword was fair and just like himself. However, compared to Tirid, it was too light, and so the protagonist easily blocked Tion's attack. He was indignant at his remark, and the protagonist explained that Tirid's sword was heavy and precise, but Tion's sword now looked like it was just imitating Tirid's sword. He asked indignantly, and MC decided to show him his fighting style that he used to fight Tirid. He ran forward, and his movements were very fast. However, Tion was still confident that he could block it. He was not going to accept that Tirid was defeated by such a sword, and he tried to block the attack, but the protagonist suddenly changed direction, and Tion froze in shock, and in the next moment, the sword hit him in the face again. He was sure that he had blocked the strike accurately, and so he did not understand how it happened. Curse thought that MC would have an easier time because of his connections with Tirid, but he took it more seriously, as he was sure that a stubborn knight like Tion would not stop until he was knocked out. If he did not make him unconscious, Tion would attack him until he died. However, contrary to the protagonist's expectations, Tion, who did not believe that he could not handle such swordsmanship, kept his balance, and even MC was surprised that he withstood this blow. He shouted that he was the eldest son destined to lead the family and raised his sword to attack, but the protagonist used the Royal Mercenary Skill Knight Destroyer and ran past Tion, hitting him and knocking the weapon out of his hands. This time, he did not fall either, as Dyer caught him in time, assuming that he was causing trouble. Aiden replied that it was nothing to worry about, but was surprised that Dyer knew Tion. But at least now he would not have to look for him so hard, since Dyer was one of the 3 people he came to. Dyer was glad to meet him. He was the younger brother of the traitor knight Silbit, and when MC remembered this, Dyer introduced himself. The Sias dukedom was called the sword that guarded the northern continent. It was known as the strongest knight line, and there was no one who inherited this bloodline who did not become a master of the sword. They were famous for choosing their lord solely based on their fighting skills, and if the protagonist were to be reborn into this family, he would already be a swordmaster. A person like Dyer was called a genius, and he was born once every 100 years into such a family. At this point, MC had already stepped aside, watching the nobles, including Dyer, talking to each other. Curse had heard the name Sias several times, but this was the first time he had heard the name Dyer. However, he believed that now would be the best time to approach Dyer if the protagonist was going to meet him. However, he was sure that the best time would come, and until then, he was going to do something else. But he was distracted from his thoughts, as he felt a piercing gaze behind him. They were nobles who approached him with delight, starting to get acquainted with him. He was displeased with all the attention he was getting, but he was even more irritated by the nickname Troll Lord that someone had uttered. After a while, he went out onto the balcony, hoping that the nobles wouldn't come after him here. Curse wondered if he hated these nobles, since they had looked down on him just a moment ago. However, he didn't understand what there was to hate. After all humans were the same. That was how they were made, and they clung to a person when they were needed, but discarded them when they had exhausted their usefulness. He advised the Demon Lord not to trust him too much, since he himself was a human. And yet, he trusted him, and it was unexpectedly touching. So the protagonist even felt embarrassed. But the thing was that MC was more like a troll than a human, and that's why Curse trusted him 100%. Aiden was indignant and promised to drink 100 bottles of holy potion when they returned. But his further argument with the Demon Lord was interrupted by a girl appearing on the balcony. She recognized his fighting style as the Mercenary King's swordsmanship, and he was surprised that she recognized Valken's swordsmanship. Her energy seemed familiar to him, and he realized that the last person he needed to meet had come on her own. He wondered if she had seen this skill before. She had not seen it, but she had heard about it, since the Mercenary King's skill could make any defense useless, and if Valken was a knight, he would undoubtedly deserve a great honor. However, MC understood that Valken would have saluted the dogs if it did not bring him money. Still, he agreed out loud that this was most likely the case, but he changed the subject and suggested that this banquet was too boring. He hated these formal events. He didn't care how much his interlocutor changed her appearance, since he couldn't forget her presence after hundreds of fights with her. He turned to her for confirmation of his words and called her by name. Niseda dropped her disguise, not going to deny it, and asked how he awakened this sword. He answered that a friend helped him, and in fact he was sure that she would come if he took Beelzebub. She didn't like the fact that he was trying to dodge, and decided to ask again. She was curious about where the demonic energy flowing from his body came from. She used a killer aura, but MC expected it from her. He tried not to show the effect on himself and assumed that the demonic energy coming from his body was the Demon Lord, and was surprised that Niseda felt it. But he decided to discuss it later, because although they were a match for each other in past lives, this time they needed to try differently. He explained that he was on Nisette's side, and she didn't understand what he meant, as she doubted that he knew anything about her. He told her quite a lot about her, and assumed that it was enough. And she admitted that he knew a lot, but she didn't understand how he knew it. Due to her loss of concentration, her murderous aura weakened, and MC warned her that something was about to happen. So they didn't have much time. She ordered him to stop prevaricating and answer her, but suddenly she noticed a glowing magical seal appear in the courtyard of the estate. It was black magic for summoning undead, and she didn't expect her opponents to escalate the situation so much, but MC knew that they always followed the same pattern. This black magic would not end until the summoner died, and although he believed that Nisette had many questions for him, he offered to deal with this first. He knew that she was there to capture the heretical group of Chaos Black Mages, and she was amazed that he even knew that. She suggested that they continue their conversation later and disappeared from her place, and Aiden decided to leave it to her while he prepared to deal with this side. Monsters began to emerge from the magic circle, and soon they burst inside the banquet hall. The knights took a defensive stand, and Tyan was one of those who entered the battle. He threw the monsters aside, telling the others not to be afraid. By this time, MC had also returned to the hall, and Curse was amazed that even Tyan had reached the stage of developing a sword aura. If he had achieved this at such an age, it meant that he was very strong, but he had simply chosen the wrong opponent. The protagonist assumed that he always felt that he was losing because of his friend. At this time, an undead troll appeared in the hall, and the knights hoped for reinforcements, since such a monster was dangerous. However, while even Tyan knew that he would have to wait for reinforcements, Dyer ran past him and pierced the troll with a single blow. Curse suggested that Dyer was one step away from becoming a sword master, and Aiden agreed with him, as he was only at the half-master stage. Tyan was strong enough, but having Dyer as his closest friend and rival meant that he was extremely unlucky. The Demon Lord wondered why the protagonist was not helping them, instead of just messing around. He was sure that they could handle this on their own, and besides, he needed to confirm something. Curse wondered what he was talking about, and at that moment, a new monster appeared, emitting incredibly dense demonic energy. Tyan warned Dyer about this, and the monster entered the room and called out to Dyer, after which it immediately took off, approaching him. It jumped into the air, swinging its sword, but the moment it struck, Dyer did not take any damage as MC stood in front of it, stopping the undead's strike with his shield. This Death Knight was the strongest of the undead, and it had ruined the banquet in the past. The protagonist thought that something was wrong, and it happened as he expected. Even if it was the strongest undead, Dyer, as a half-master, should be able to handle it. He always wondered why he lost in his past life, but it turned out that this knight was enhanced by dark magic and had strength that surpassed that of a half-master. The protagonist would not have been able to block this monster's attack if it weren't for the Banshee Spirit Shield, and now he understood why Dyer lost. The monster then said Dyer's name again, and the protagonist became wary as he realized that it said something. The Death Knight didn't need others, and this pushed MC away, and he realized what exactly had happened. He was sure that he should have noticed earlier that the undead were not moving to attack, but to separate Dyer from the rest of the soldiers. This whole thing was planned just to kill him. The Death Knight tried to attack Dyer several more times, but Aiden took each of these blows on his shield. The knight was also a half-master, and this one's attacks were oppressing him so much that he had no choice but to block. However, he was not alone, so he told Dyer when to attack. He struck, but the Death Knight easily blocked it, and this one's weapon did not even leave a scratch. Dyer could not even believe that it parried his spear strike so easily, and the protagonist warned that this knight was at least a half-master. However, he did not immediately understand why so many monsters were targeting Dyer specifically. He didn't realize that the person who would benefit the most from Dyer's disappearance was the one who was a pain in the ass with him, and he realized that there was only one such person, and that was Silbetta. If this continued, Dyer would overshadow him, and despite being the eldest son in the family, he would only end up knighted, since the head was chosen by merit. Before, the protagonist thought that Silbetta was just lucky to become the king of knights. But now he understood how he became one. He was angry that he was in secret collusion with dark mages. The more he looked, the more rotten everything seemed. But he was distracted from his thoughts, because Dyer asked how they were supposed to deal with their opponent. He knew how they could deal with it, and Dyer was amazed that he was able to deal with such a monster. With the technique that MC had invented, it was possible to defeat even a much stronger opponent, and Dyer was excited for him to say the name of this technique. His technique was called the provocation tactic, and Dyer doubted that it could actually be a tactic, but he decided to try it anyway. Curse noted that there was no time that MC did not provoke the enemy, and he explained that it was because it always worked. Besides, if you give a tactic a name, then everything becomes legal. The Death Knight was still aiming at Dyer, intending to kill him, and as it ran forward to attack once again, its sword collided with the protagonist's shield again. Once again, Silbett's treacherous nature was revealed, but this time everything would be different. The knight ordered the protagonist to leave and not interfere, but at the moment when it swung, Dyer concentrated his energy to strike again. He actually did it, and his attacks were surprisingly strong, and even MC admitted it. If Dyer had hit correctly, even the Death Knight would have been finished, but it managed to dodge and jumped up to attack Dyer. He meanwhile started looking around as he didn't feel anything from his attack. And suddenly he noticed a monster approaching him, and from its strike dust rose into the air. However, the knight trembled in anger as MC parried this one's attack again, and started to tease the knight as it was too easy for him. In the end, the monster decided to kill him first, and then Dyer, and started to deal powerful blows, which the protagonist blocked. So they fought in this way, acting alternately, and at first Aiden blocked the monster's attacks, and then Dyer dealt blows himself. After a while they stopped for a while, and although they were able to parry all the attacks, their blows were also unsuccessful, and Dyer did not understand why there was not a single scratch on their opponent. MC smiled madly, but did not answer, and he called out to him in a worried manner. Even Curse did not understand what was wrong with him, and assumed that Beelzebub had taken possession of him again, but that was not the case. Aiden replied that he was fine and asked them not to worry, and Curse indignantly repeated his words, reminding him that if the protagonist died, he would go straight after him. His dissatisfaction was also due to the fact that the protagonist was barely coping with parrying, and his attack was generally bad. However, he could attack, and he was just waiting for the right moment. With his current abilities, he would not even be able to scratch the enemy, so he needed the power of the shield. The Demon Lord realized that he wanted to attack with the shield's spirit, and MC thought that it would be quite easy, since this shield was permeated with the spirit of the Mad Banshee. As he said before, the more the shield was used, the madder the Banshee would become. And eventually the owner would also be overwhelmed by the madness and become proportionally stronger. In his current state, the protagonist was able to approach the level of a half-master, and he ran next to the knight, dealing a blow to him. Dyer was amazed at the strength he saw, and guessed that MC had been hiding his strength all this time. He knew from their battle that Aiden was quite strong, but he never thought that he had already reached the level of a half-master. But now, he knew that he was strong enough to surpass even the Death Knight, since he was able to deal a deep wound to him. The frenzy had unsettled the protractor a bit, and Curse assumed that none of his artifacts, including Beelzebub, were in good condition. The better the artifact, the more likely it was to have flaws, and the Demon Lord thought it was a trivial matter, since the artifacts were like their owners. Since the protagonist hadn't used the shield for a long time, the frenzy was hard to control, so he was going to finish it off quickly. He activated the speed ring, and at that moment, the knight ran up to him to attack. When it hit, a huge amount of dust rose into the air, and the knight advised MC to die, but he managed to dodge the attack and took advantage of the monster freezing while striking himself, and he managed to injure his opponent again. Because of the dust, the knight couldn't see anything, and he wondered where the protagonist was. It announced its location and attacked again, and the fact that it had become even faster meant that Dyer would only get in the way if he decided to help it. The protagonist offered the monster to burn in hell, promising that soon the owner of this would follow it. He dealt a few more quick blows, but the knight could not die, because if it died, the mission would not be completed. That is why it took off, despite its wounds, and ran towards Dyer, and he was amazed at how fast it was. The knight had already swung his sword to attack it and complete its mission. When the protagonist was about to put an end to the monster, but it suddenly turned away from the fight with him and ran towards Dyer. He himself did not understand why this happened. He was horrified when he noticed that the knight was already very close to Dyer and swung his sword to attack him. But the side effect of the speed ring was starting to take effect, and so Aiden would not be able to run to Dyer in time, and thus everything would go exactly according to Silbit's plan. Dyer also could not do anything to defend himself, and at that moment, Tyon ran closer. He knew that he would never be able to defeat such a strong opponent that even Dyer could not defeat. However, he was not going to let the knight kill his best friend and rival. At that moment, he remembered Tyon's words about the difference between his style and his father's, and so he, taking advantage of these characteristics, adjusted his technique and dealt a powerful blow to the knight. It gradually began to disappear, although the mission was not yet completed. The other undead also began to disappear, and the knights assumed that it all depended on the Death Knight. They were shocked that this monster was defeated with a single swing of the sword, and surrounded Tyon, starting to praise him. He flinched in surprise, and at that moment, Dyer came closer to him, admiringly noting that he had become a half-master and saved his life. He understood what it was like to be surpassed, and promised that he would pay Tyon back one day. He agreed, but did not seem particularly happy about it. Dyer suggested that they not forget about the other person, and wanted to call out to Aiden, but did not notice him where he stood. Tyon doubted that he was the one who defeated the knight, since judging by his blow, this was not at all certain. MC, meanwhile, moved away from the place where the knights were gathered, realizing that it was not right to abuse the buffs so often. He needed to rest quickly, as Seth and Curse suggested that he enjoy his victory for a while. If he did not rest now, he might never open his eyes, so he could not enjoy it, and besides, it was still too early to celebrate the victory. He understood that this was only the first step, and assumed that if Silbetta was communicating with black magicians, then the rest of the people in their companies were far from innocent either. Curse noticed that MC had at least calculated the time perfectly, because at one moment everything could go exactly according to Silbetta's plan. It was true, and it turned out that Naseda was incredibly strong. He was glad that she dealt with the Chaos people in time, as it broke the spell and the Death Knight disappeared. But if a little more time had passed, they would have screwed up. Before he could continue thinking, Law ran closer to him, worried about his condition. He told him about the undead that suddenly appeared, and the protagonist wondered where he had been all this time. He had fought the undead, and the protagonist praised him and suggested that he rest, and he immediately agreed. In the morning, in the premium box of the palace, Aiden was sprawled on the bed. He finally woke up, noticing that he had fallen asleep as soon as he lay down. Naseda noticed that he slept a lot, and he was surprised that she was here. She warned him that she had put up a sound barrier, and he was surprised by this. He knew he wouldn't be able to get out of this conversation, but he